I was racing through a Georgia storm, drenched and daring, when my stepdad Nate chased me down to stop my stunt. I taunted him to join my chaos, pulling him close, and our soaked collision ignited a reckless spark. Where it took us, you'll be shocked. I was bolting through our Georgia backyard one muggy evening, rain pounding my skin, chasing the rush of a storm that had blown in fast, when my stepdad Nate, a 56-year-old ex-racecar mechanic who now ran a dive bar downtown, barreled out the back door, yelling my name like I'd lost my mind running circles in the mud. I'd been cooped up all day, Mom's landscape designs cluttering the dining table while she sketched, and I craved something louder than her pencil scratches, so I laughed, dodging his grab, saying he'd have to catch me if he wanted me inside, my voice sharp, daring. As I spun through the wet grass, my shirt soaked, clinging tight, knowing he'd chase because he'd always fixed my messes, from flat tires to late-night snacks when Mom was too busy. He lunged, boots slipping, cursing the downpour, and I taunted him, saying a guy who'd wrenched cars for racers should be quicker, my hand splashing water at him, grinning when he flinched, his own shirt plastered to his chest, showing the strength he still carried from pits and engines. I darted toward the oak tree, yelling he'd gone soft pouring beers instead of burning rubber, and he tackled me, his arms wrapping my waist, pulling me down into the mud, both of us sliding, my back against his chest, his breath hot on my neck as I squirmed, saying he'd cheated, my fingers digging into his forearms, not pushing away, the rain blurring everything but how close we'd landed. He held tight, saying I'd kill myself out here, but his voice was rougher, like he felt the same jolt I did, my hips pressing back, teasing, daring him to hold on, the storm drowning out the world except us. I twisted, facing him, mud smearing my cheek, and said he didn't scare me, not even soaked and pinned, my hands grabbing his collar, pulling him closer, saying he'd have to try harder to stop me, my eyes locked on his, sharp, testing, feeling his grip shift, one hand sliding to my hip, steady, too warm for just keeping me still. He said I was trouble he didn't need, but he didn't let go, his fingers tightening, like he was fighting something older than this rain, and I leaned in, saying trouble was what he missed, wasn't it? My voice low, goading, the air thick with more than just water, his eyes dark, catching mine too long, like we'd forgotten where we were until headlights swept the driveway, Mom's car rolling in, her conference call cut short by the weather. I shoved him, scrambling up, saying he'd better not rat me out, my hand brushing his as I stood, quick, flirty, to keep the spark alive, and he rose, mud streaked across his shirt, muttering we'd both catch hell if she saw us like this, his glance heavy, like he meant more than the mess. I ran for the porch, yelling I'd beat him inside, my pulse hammering, knowing Mom was steps away, her keys gingling as she parked, clueless we'd been tangled out here, inches from something we couldn't name. He followed, slower, and I turned at the door, saying he'd owe me for not squealing, my grin daring him to answer, my wet hair dripping as I slipped inside, feeling his eyes on me, the storm still raging, but not as loud as what we'd started in that mud. Mom called from the hall, asking why the floor was wet, and I shouted I'd been caught in the rain, my voice steady, but my chest burned, knowing Nate was wiping mud off his hands behind me, silent, like he'd felt the same line we'd almost crossed. Her focus was on her soggy blueprints, not us, and I headed upstairs, the rain's roar fading, but not the heat of his grip, already pulling me to find it again, no matter how close she got. A few days after the rain-soaked wrestle in our Georgia yard left my nerves buzzing, I was restless with Mom's landscape sketches piling up on every surface, so I slipped out one night to Nate's bar downtown, knowing he'd be there after closing, figuring I could poke at the spark we'd lit when we'd slid through the mud together. I texted him I was coming, saying I'd help lock up if he shared a soda, my words light to mask the itch driving me, and he replied to use the back door, his bar a dimly lit dive where locals nursed beers, far from Mom's manicured gardens and her late-night calls with clients. I parked behind the building, sneaking in past the dumpster, my pulse already up, knowing Mom thought I was at a friend's, not here chasing trouble with her husband. Inside, the bar was empty, stools upturned, the jukebox silent, and Nate was wiping down the counter, his flannel rolled to his elbows, looking more like the guy who'd fixed race cars than the one pouring drafts, and I leaned against the bar, saying he'd better have something stronger than cola for me, my grin sharp, teasing, to pull him back to that stormy night. He smirked, saying I'd get what he gave me, and slid a mocktail across, his fingers brushing mine, deliberate, warm, sending a jolt like when he'd grabbed me in the rain, and I sipped it, saying he'd gone soft if this was his best shot. My eyes locked on his, daring him to bite. He leaned closer, saying I'd be surprised what he could still pull off, his voice low, rough, like he meant more than drinks, the bars quiet wrapping us tight, like we'd stepped out of Mom's world. I asked about his racing days, saying a guy like him must have hidden some stories he didn't tell her, and he paused, then nodded to a staircase behind the cooler, saying I'd see for myself if I wasn't scared of dust, his tone goading, pulling me up to a cramped loft stuffed with old gear, wrenches, a cracked helmet, photos of him grinning by stock cars. I picked up the helmet, saying he'd looked wilder back then, not like the guy stuck with Mom's plant orders, and I tossed it to him, stepping close, my hip grazing his, teasing that I'd bet he missed breaking rules, my voice soft, meant to dig. He caught it, setting it down, and turned, his hand brushing my arm, saying I was breaking enough for both of us, his eyes dark, holding mine, the loft's shadows making it feel like we'd vanished from anyone who'd care. I leaned against a crate, saying he'd have to show me what breaking meant, and he stepped closer, his fingers grazing my wrist, whispering I'd regret asking, his breath warm, too close, like we'd picked up right where the rain left off. My pulse hammering as I tilted my chin, saying regrets weren't my style, my words sharp, daring him to push it. He smirked, his hand lingering, and I grabbed his sleeve, pulling him nearer, saying he wasn't scared, was he, my voice barely above the loft's creak, the air so thick I could have sworn we'd spark. My phone buzzed texting she was 5 minutes away, saying she'd swing by to grab me, thinking I was at a cafe nearby, and I froze, shoving it in my pocket, saying we'd better move, my hand still on him, quick, flirty, to keep the heat despite her shadow. We scrambled downstairs, Nate flipping off lights, and I leaned against the bar, saying he'd owe me for keeping quiet, my fingers tapping his chest, light, teasing, as he locked the back door, his glance heavy, like he knew we'd dodged a bullet but wanted another round. Mom's car never showed, she'd gone home, texting she was tired, but I slipped out, heart racing, knowing she'd been too close, and Nate's whisper about next time followed me into the night, the loft's dust still on my skin, pulling me back for more, no matter who was watching. A week after the bar loft had my heart racing, I was stuck in our Georgia house one humid evening, Mom downstairs sketching garden layouts for a client, her pencils scratching loud enough to drive me up the wall, when I slipped into the garage, knowing Nate was there tinkering with my old bike, figuring I could stir the spark we'd nearly blown out with her text so close last time. I'd told her I was grabbing a wrench to fix a shelf, but really, I wanted to see if he'd bite again, his bar shifts keeping him out late, far from her plant catalogs, and I found him crouched by the bike, grease smearing his hands, looking like the racer he'd been before pouring beers and playing her steady husband. I leaned against the workbench, saying he'd better not wreck my ride, my voice light, teasing, to pull him back to that muddy yard, my shorts riding up as I crossed my arms, watching his eyes flick up, quick, before he hit it. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag, saying I'd have to earn a fix by helping, not just mouthing off, and I grabbed a socket wrench, saying I'd show him up, stepping close, my hip brushing his as I leaned over the bike, daring him to keep it cool with Mom's voice drifting through the kitchen door, asking where I'd gone. I smirked, saying he'd looked wilder fixing cars for speed freaks, not like the guy stuck with her mulch orders, and I handed him a bolt, my fingers grazing his palm, slow, deliberate, feeling his pulse jump, the garage's hum mixing with her footsteps, making every second sharper, like we'd stolen it from her right under her nose. He took it, saying I didn't know wild, his voice low, rough, and he shifted closer, his hand brushing my wrist, whispering I'd better watch what I started, his eyes dark, like he'd forgotten the door wasn't locked. I knelt by the tire, saying he'd have to teach me something worth learning, and he crouched beside me, his knee against mine, guiding my hand to tighten a chain, his fingers wrapping mine, warm, steady, sending a spark that made my breath catch, like when he'd pinned me in the rain, only now Mom was yards away, her voice calling my name, sharp, saying she needed help with a blueprint. I froze, but didn't pull back, saying he'd better make this quick, my voice soft, goading, my shoulder pressing his, and he smirked, saying quick wasn't his style, his thumb tracing my knuckle, slow, risky, like he knew she could walk in any second, the garage light buzzing overhead, throwing shadows that felt too loud for what we weren't saying. She shouted again, closer, her steps hitting the hall, and I stood, tossing the wrench down, saying he'd owe me for covering, my hand brushing his chest, quick, flirty, as I darted to the door, yelling back that I'd found the tool, my heart slamming like I'd sprinted a mile, knowing she'd buy it if I played it cool. Nate stayed low, muttering we'd pushed it too far, but his eyes followed me, heavy, like he wasn't ready to stop, and I slipped into the kitchen, Mom barely glancing up from her papers, saying I'd taken long enough, her focus on roses, not the grease on my hands or the flush I couldn't hide. I said I'd dropped the wrench, my voice steady, but my skin burned where his fingers had been, and I knew he was still out there, tools clinking, like he was waiting for me to come back. I lingered by the sink, saying I'd clean up, and when she turned back to her designs, I caught Nate's shadow in the doorway, silent, his rag twisting in his hands, and I shot him a look, saying under my breath he'd better fix more than bikes next time, my grin daring him to answer. He didn't, just nodded, but the air stayed charged, and I knew Mom's call had been too close, her steps too near, pulling me to chase that rush again, no matter how tight the rope we were walking. A month after the garage had us dodging Mom's voice, I was itching for something to jolt me out of the Georgia heat, where her garden blueprints smothered every corner of the house. When Nate mentioned he was hitting a junkyard outside town to hunt parts for a vintage sign he wanted to rig up at his bar, and asked if I'd tag along, saying I might spot something cool in the wreckage. I'd been replaying his hands on mine too much, so I jumped at it, teasing that he'd probably get lost without me, my voice light but sharp, knowing Mom was out measuring a client's lawn, giving us a window to slip away, her texts about shrubs far from whatever we'd find among rusted hulks. I threw on boots, following him to his truck, my pulse already up, expecting a quick grab and go, not the twist waiting in that scrap heap. The junkyard stretched wide, a maze of crushed cars and tangled metal baking under the noon sun, the air thick with oil and dust, and Nate led the way, pointing out fenders he'd scavenged back when he fixed racecars, his flannel sticking to his back as he climbed over a hood, saying I'd better keep up or he'd leave me for the crows. I laughed, scrambling after, saying he'd looked tougher wrenching for speed freaks than picking through trash, and when I hopped onto a busted trunk, I tossed a spark plug at him, grinning when he caught it, saying I'd found his treasure first, my shorts catching on the metal, tugging low, his eyes flicking there before he tossed it back, saying I'd have to try dirtier tricks, his voice rough, sparking like the mud we'd rolled in. Instead of pushing closer, I veered off, weaving through wrecks, yelling I'd beat him to something better, my boots crunching glass as I ducked into a half-smashed van, its seats torn, dashboard cracked, figuring I'd hide to mess with him, but the space felt too tight, like it held stories he hadn't told. He called my name, his steps heavy, and I stayed quiet, crouching, until he found me, leaning through the window, saying I'd picked a hell of a spot to get stuck, his hand reaching to pull me out, warm, steady, but I grabbed his wrist, saying he'd have to join me first. My voice low, daring, pulling him inside, the van's frame groaning as he climbed in, his knee brushing mine, the air stale, closing us in like we ditched the world. I asked what crashed his racing days, not expecting much, but he sat back, shadows cutting his face, saying he'd burned too many bridges chasing winds, things Mom never heard, his voice raw, like I'd pried open something he'd locked since the tracks. I shifted closer, my hand on the seat near his, saying he didn't seem done burning, not with me around, my words soft, flirty, but curious, and he looked at me, saying I'd light a fire he couldn't put out, his fingers grazing my knuckles, slow, like he meant it. The van feeling smaller, our breaths loud until a crow screeched outside, wings flapping hard, and I jolted, laughing, saying we'd scared the damn thing, my shoulder bumping his to shake the weight of his words. We climbed out, dust on our hands, and I said he'd owe me for dragging me to his graveyard, tossing a bolt at him, quick, playful, but kept my distance, sensing he'd given more than he planned, his confession shifting something heavier between us. He caught it, saying I'd picked it, not him, and we grabbed a rusted grill for his sign, heading back, Mom's text pinging, some plant delivery, no clue we'd been gone, but I nudged him, saying he'd better hide those stories next time, my hand brushing his arm, light, to keep the spark, his eyes holding mine, like he knew we'd be back in deeper, no matter who drove by. By summer, I was choking on the Georgia heat and Mom's endless plant diagrams cluttering our house, when Nate caught me scrolling aimlessly one night, saying he was checking an old speedway he'd raced it years ago, now abandoned, and asked if I'd sneak out with him to see if it still had ghosts, his voice low, like he knew I'd bite after the junkyard's heavy air lingered too long. I'd been craving something to shake me since his confession among wrecks, so I slipped on a hoodie, texting Mom I'd be at a movie, her focus on a new gazebo design keeping her blind to my lie, and met Nate at his truck, teasing that he'd better not crash us chasing memories, my grin sharp, ready for whatever he'd throw, expecting a quick look, not the rush waiting on that cracked asphalt. The speedway loomed dark under a half-moon, its bleachers rusted, track overgrown with weeds, the air thick with gasoline's faint echo, and Nate parked by a busted gate, saying we'd have to climb it, his eyes glinting like when he'd pulled me into that van. But this felt bigger, wilder, like we'd slipped past rules entirely. I scrambled over, laughing when he steadied my waist, my hands grabbing his shoulders, saying he'd owe me if I twisted an ankle, my voice light, flirty, but laced with a thrill as I dropped to the other side, him following, his boots hitting hard, like he'd run this place in his blood once. I jogged to the track, yelling he'd never catch me here, but instead of chasing, he tossed me a flashlight, saying I'd need it to find his old pit stop, turning it into a hunt, not a fight, his smirk daring me to lead, flipping what I'd expected. We wove through shadows, beams catching faded tire marks, and I asked why he'd quit racing when this place screened his name, my words curious, not taunting, and he stopped by a crumbled wall, saying it wasn't the track he'd left, but the people who'd burned him, his voice raw, like I'd unlocked another piece he'd kept from Mom's tidy life. I stepped closer, saying he didn't seem burned out to me, my hand brushing his sleeve, soft, not pushing, and he handed me a rusted lug nut from the dirt, saying I'd keep this place alive better than him, his fingers grazing mine, warm, steady, shifting the air without needing to grab me, the track's silence wrapping us like a secret we'd both guard. I climbed a rickety grandstand, him trailing, and sat high, swinging my legs, saying we should race it for real, just us, and he leaned beside me, saying I'd spin out before the first turn, his shoulder nudging mine, his voice teasing, but his eyes held something heavier, like he saw me clearer here than in her house. I flicked the flashlight off, letting the dark pull us closer, saying he'd crash first, my breath catching when his hand rested near my knee, not touching, just close enough to spark, and I leaned toward him, saying crashes might be worth it, my words quiet, daring. The moment stretching until a spotlight swept the track, a security guard's truck rolling in, its beam cutting the night, forcing us to duck, my body pressed to his behind a rail, hearts pounding, not from fear but from how tight we'd woven ourselves. We slid down, sprinting to the gate, his hand on my back, guiding, and I whispered we'd beat them, my grin wild as we vaulted over, landing hard, laughing, my arm hooking his for balance, quick, flirty, to keep the rush alive. The guard didn't follow, and we peeled out, Mom's text waiting, some plant question, no clue I'd been gone, but I turned to Nate, saying he'd topped the junkyard, my fingers tapping his wrist, saying next time I'd pick the track, my voice low, feeling his glance burn, like we'd left more than dust behind, knowing we'd chase it again, no matter how close her headlights got. 6 months after the rain-soaked chase that flipped my world, I was fraying under Mom's endless plant charts clogging our Georgia house, when Nate called me to his bar one sticky August night, saying he needed help planning a big anniversary bash for his place, claiming my eye for chaos would make it legendary, though I knew he wanted me there for the same pull that had dragged us from mud to speedways. I'd been dodging his glances since the track's shadows, so I slipped out, telling Mom I was meeting friends, her focus on a design expo she was supposedly at, giving me a free pass to dive back into the buzz we'd built, expecting a quick brainstorm, not the fire waiting in his dive's dim light. The bar was closed, its neon sign off, tables cleared except for one tucked in a back corner, where Nate sat with papers and a bottle of soda, his flannel loose, hair mussed like he'd been wrenching engines again, not just pouring drinks. I slid into the booth, saying he'd better not waste my night on budgets, my voice sharp, teasing, as I leaned across, my knee brushing his under the table, quick, to spark what we'd left on that grandstand, and he smirked, saying I'd be the one begging to stay, pushing a sketch of the bar's layout at me, his fingers grazing mine, warm, deliberate, like he'd planned more than a party. I grabbed a pen, saying his ideas looked tame for a guy who'd raced with outlaws, my eyes catching his, daring him to prove me wrong, the bar's quiet humming like it held our secrets. We spread out flyers, plotting string lights and a stage, but I leaned closer, saying he'd throw a better bash if he let loose like he used to, my hand resting near his on the table, fingers tapping, flirty, as I asked what kind of trouble he'd stirred at his wildest gigs, wanting the Nate who'd confessed in Rex, not Mom's steady fix-it guy. He paused, then slid his chair beside mine, saying I'd run from real trouble, his voice low, rough, his arm brushing my shoulder, sending a jolt sharper than the loft's dust, and I tilted my head, saying running wasn't my thing, my breath catching when he leaned in, his hand hovering over mine, not touching, just close enough to make the booth feel like a trap we both wanted. I flipped a flyer, pointing at a stage spot, saying we'd need music to wake this place up, and bumped his elbow, teasing that he'd probably pick something boring, my voice soft, goading, and he grabbed my wrist, light, saying I'd like his taste if I tried it. His thumb grazing my skin, slow, like he'd forgotten the papers, the bar, her rules, his eyes locked on mine, dark, pulling me into a space where plans didn't matter. I didn't pull back, saying taste was a bold word for him, my fingers curling toward his, the table's edge digging into my hip, every inch between us screaming, like we'd crash if we moved, the booth's shadows hiding what Mom would have seen a mile off, until a door slammed. Her voice cutting through, yelling Nate's name, furious, her expo cancelled early, her boots stomping toward us. She rounded the corner, eyes blazing, papers flying as she threw her bag down, screaming what we were doing holed up like this, her voice cracking, saying she'd known I was too close, always hanging on him, and turned on Nate, shrieking he'd slid back to his old games. Her words sharp, digging at betrayals I didn't understand, her fists clenched like she'd hit him. I stood, stammering we were just planning, but she cut me off, yelling I'd crossed lines she'd seen coming, and Nate rose, saying it wasn't what she thought, his voice tight, but she shoved a chair, shouting he'd lied before, her rage drowning us. I grabbed my phone, bolting for the exit, her screams chasing me, calling me a wrecker, and I didn't look back, the bar's neon flickering, Nate's sketch left behind, our sparks snuffed out by her fire, leaving me to wonder what she'd meant about his past.